I bid you welcome.
I welcome you to my house.
Welcome to my house.
Welcome to my home.
Hello horror hounds and welcome to my horror house. Last night the BBC aired episode 2 of their new adaptation of Dracula, an episode called Blood Vessel. Do you see what they did there? Because as expected, pretty much the entirety of the episode took place on board the Demeter. And as with the first episode, they took a relatively small section of the book and sort of expanded upon it. I suspect if there were things that annoyed you in episode 1, there's more of that in episode 2. If you dug some of the things that were going on in episode 1, there's more of that in episode 2. In its own 90 minutes, it has its own beginning, middle and end, and I'm sure Mark Gatiss and Steven Moffat tried to make these little 90-minute mini movies. It does feel like the middle piece of a trilogy as it is. It does feel like a bit of an intermezzo, a bridging between the beginning and the end. One of the notes I wrote towards the start of the episode was this feels less urgent than the previous episode, but I do get the sense that there is a shoe waiting to drop, and indeed there is, and we will talk later about that ending. I'm still episode by episode trying to get a handle on what this adaptation of Dracula is, and I still can't quite decide how much I like it, and I don't think I will be able to decide until I've seen all of it, especially with that ending. It's probably a bit of a fool's errand to try and identify the division of labour between Mark Gatiss and Steven Moffat. This feels much more Moffat-y to me. It's got a lot more of his writerly quirks in it, and if you've watched enough of his Doctor Who and enough of their Sherlock and enough of Mark Gatiss's solo writing efforts, I mean, all writers have their little quirks and their kinks, their little furrows that they plough, and I think it's fair to say that some of Moffat's more overtly writerly quirks can at times rub me up the wrong way. He can seem a little too smug and a little too self-satisfied, and there are parts of this adaptation of Dracula that are edging ever closer to those waters and away from a really decent adaptation of Dracula. It's very clear now that whilst they do love the source material, they are playing fast and they are playing loose. I think if that wasn't your bag in episode 1 and you've stuck through to episode 2 to see if it picks up, probably won't be tuning into episode 3 unless it's to write angry hashtags on Twitter. Being the middle episode of 3, it's also an episode of 2 halves. The first half very much has the structure of the first episode, with seemingly 2 time periods, with a present that involves Sister Agatha Van Helsing interviewing someone to find out what has just happened. In this case, interviewing Dracula to find out what happened on the Demeter. But there is a very Moffat-y twist in the middle, and the second half becomes very much a battle of wills between Dracula and Sister Agatha. And I do like their dynamic together. I loved them facing off at the gates of the nunnery. I love them facing off in the Demeter, and I am looking forward to seeing this opposition that's been set up resolving in the 3rd episode. And I do want it to have a resolution. I want this to end. If we go through 3 sets of 90 minutes and it's all just we can have a series 2 if you want. Now, I know you can. Even if the Count dies at the end of series 3, you can always bring him back. I don't want this to be a setup for more Dracula. I want there to be a story that they wanted to tell. I suspect that that will be the case, because one of the things Steven Moffat likes to do is he likes to flag up in what he thinks of as subtext how clever he is when he resolves things at the end. And Quite a lot of pieces of dialogue in episode 2 are about the act of storytelling. Dracula himself opens the episode talking about the contract between the storyteller and the reader. The Duchess on board the Demeter says that she was invited to England by a Mr. Blower, that we find out is Dracula, because he wants to write her life story. The cook on board, when the guy pretending to be Piotr tells him why he's on board the ship, he says, when you tell your story, you know what it sounds like? A story. They are telling us their story of Dracula. And the other thing that's flagged up in this episode is the metaphorical game of chess between Sister Agatha and Dracula. And Dracula at the end says, there can't be two queens on this board. They also allude again in this episode to Dracula trying to procreate, and they allude again to the reasons why Dracula abides by the rules that he does and why he fears the cross. I suspect and hope the purpose for this story, the contract they've set up with us, will be resolved in episode 3, and we will find out about why he abides by those rules. And we also know now that he is going to hook up with this adaptation's version of Lucy Westenra, and I guess we'll try and locate a new bride to procreate with, and I think that will be resolved. What that resolution might look like given the end of episode 2, God only knows. It might be set on a fucking space station. We've already had in episode 1 lots of allusions to Dracula's past, and we get them again now, and it's a really mixed bag. I love the formal dress of Dracula, which harkens back to Bela Lugosi. I hope they weren't going to leave Bela out. And they didn't, thank goodness. But this whole notion of Dracula trying to procreate gives me the horrible shivers of Stephen Sommers' Van Helsing, which is a fucking atrocious movie. The only other sort of adaptation of Dracula that has tried to come up with a cohesive reason why, well, in that film, the sunlight, the fear of the crosses, and why silver is deadly, is Dracula 2000, known in the UK as Dracula 2001 because it wasn't released in the year 2000. That Gerard Butler movie that is mostly appalling, apart from the mythological reasons behind those counts rules, is really quite intriguing. And also, now I'm thinking about it, Dracula 2000 also has a Van Helsing who sort of transcends time through vampiric means to try and keep tabs on and restrict Dracula. So we're delving into some deep Dracula cinematic lore here, and let's be honest, some not very good Dracula cinematic lore, so I hope Gatiss and Moffat can do something better with it than their predecessors. Spending some extended time on the Demeter is an absolutely fantastic idea, and as with the sets in episode 1, the onboard set, the ship looks brilliant. It's a fantastic location, and the instinct to expand upon that brief but really dense period in the novel is an instinct I champion completely. I'm just not 100% sure it should have been this story. There's no real sense of creeping dread. There's no sense among the crew that they are doomed and that this is a cursed sort of voyage. There's no rhyme of the ancient mariner type fatalism brought to bear, and that's as a direct result of what the creators said they wanted to do, which was Dracula really doesn't appear that much beyond the first section of the book in the novel. So how do you make Dracula the anti-hero of his own story? And unfortunately, with most things horror, the more you bring it into the light, metaphorically, the less scary it gets. So Dracula is becoming less and less scary, and he is becoming more and more of a quip factory. And I'm not entirely sure that I'm down with that. How many more times can he allude to diet and eating and drinking with a double meaning wink for us? It's starting to become a little bit maddening, especially since I think Claesbang is doing a great job. There's the scene where he's overcome with the bloodlust and walks into the dining room and thinks he's alone and is banging at the walls and scratching and his teeth are out and his eyes are red, and the people in the room ask him if he's all right, and he has to compose himself. And when he turns around with the fixed on grin that's a little too fixed and a little too wide and is the closest simulacra he can come to a normal, happy, contented human being, that's absolutely fucking chilling. I'd maybe be a little more content with it if I got a stronger notion that his dander is up because finally, after all of these centuries, he's come across an adversary and a mind in Sister Agatha that actually excites and engages him. But I'm just getting the sense that he is the Joker Dracula. He has the one-liners, and all of that will be fine if they can rein that instinct in, their worst instincts, and have him be scary and evil in episode 3. Once all 3 episodes are told, if there's an even balance here, I think Claesbang will be served very, very well by the script and the flights of fancy that they've allowed him in the second half of episode 1 and all the way through episode 2. If there's a landing that they can stick, I think it will all be worth it. Dracula has to my mind at least, I mean, this is ridiculous. It's like talking about your favourite Bond, your favourite Sherlock Holmes. Everyone has their own personal Doctor Who, their own personal who Sherlock is to them, who James Bond is to them, and everyone's views are different. And Dracula is no different to all of these figures that get regenerated and reinterpreted generation after generation after generation. So I feel a little bit like I'm whistling in the wind, saying, well, this is what I want from my Dracula. I do love what Claesbang is doing at the moment. I do hope that they have a purpose and an end game in mind for episode 3 that isn't just going to be, look how clever we are. Because to a large extent, all bets are off in episode 3. I remember when it was announced quite a while ago now, a couple of years ago, that they were working on this adaptation off the back of Sherlock. And everyone was thinking, well, is it going to be period set, or are they going to set it in the modern day like they did with Sherlock and reinvent it? Well, they're having their cake and they're eating it. They've got a character who can live for centuries, and they can do both. I could only imagine at 10:30 last night the sounds of Steven Moffat and Mark Gatiss cackling like supervillains at all the WTFs that were flooding Twitter from the people watching. I worry that the best thing that will come out of this experience is to watch it on 3 consecutive nights and to see all the plates spinning and for it to all be a bit of razzmatazz with nothing of lasting quality at the end. Everything is going to hinge on episode 3. All bets are now off. Anyone who's a big fan of Angel, as soon as they saw him go into the water in his coffin, probably knew what was going on. I mean, I didn't guess it. I turned to my partner and said, are they going to have the balls to have had him underwater for 150 years and come out in one day, probably about 10 seconds before the helicopter spotlight came down? So I didn't call it by any stretch of the imagination. They got me the moment they were supposed to get me. And all you can do really at that point, if that's going to infuriate you, then don't watch episode 3. All I could do at that point really was to just throw my head back and laugh at the sheer audacity of it. If they're going to be this audacious and they have an ending in mind and there's a reason to do this, it will be fantastic. If it's another case of see how twisty, turny we can be, and if there's going to be another sort of Steven Moffat, Mark Gatiss, Sherlock montage at the end where they say, see all the little clues we gave you about how clever we're going to be? I'm probably not going to have any time for it for future viewings. If there's a reason why, and they've told us there is a contract between writer and viewer. They're telling the story of why Dracula is afraid of the cross and his attempts to procreate. So let's see what happens. But at the moment, there's everything to play for.